of culture turn themselves into niches, demographic slices or fan bases. But I think that the different iterations of roots give us a good way of thinking about the extent to which the idea of the mass audience has changed. I would be surprised if Roots in Australia, when it's screened, found an audience of more than 500,000 people, and I don't mean simultaneously, but rather over time. It's possible that you will see the trailer shared through your social media feeds. It's possible that #Roots will trend for 1 hour of one day. When it's screened here, there may be opinion pieces in the newspapers reflecting on what has changed for Black Americans in the US since 1977 and the role that race continues to play in Australia, particularly for Indigenous people. But far fewer viewers will spend 8 hours of their lives immersed in this saga. It's just the way things are now. And it's not my plan to stand here and reminisce about ye oldie pre-internet times, not least as there are better shows to watch that are more interesting and challenging than our options on that Sunday night when Roots was first screened. The alternatives that night, in case you're interested, and I'm going to tell you even if you're not, were the BBC's costume drama The Duchess of Duke Street and Country Matters on the ABC. There was a mini-series about Howard Hughes on the Channel 9 and a movie called Kansas City Bomber on Channel 7. That was it. That was television that night. The fragmentation of the form into digital, cable, streaming, DVD box sets and so on has revolutionised television content for the better. We are no longer in an era of scarcity. Audiences are the beneficiaries with more options and better, smarter, more challenging options than my 10-year-old self could possibly have imagined in 1977 or even 1987 or for that matter 1997. Of course, TV audiences still tune into reality shows and sport in big numbers all at the same time, but we'll watch pretty much everything else, including news, through iView, time shifting, recording, Netflix, Foxtel, Stan, Presto, YouTube, and so on. On a television screen in the living room, sitting next to other people, we may watch television, but it's more likely to be on our laptops or our iPads or iPhones, which may be why this program has become so popular. Gogglebox, there's a kind of nostalgia for collective TV watching. The audience as we once knew it doesn't exist anymore, and not just for television. So that's what I'm talking about today, the shift in the relationship between audiences, the creators making the things they read, watch, listen to or play, and the fact that more than ever, thanks to social media, the creator and the consumer are one and the same. In the 40 or so minutes I have left, I'm also going to be exploring two big questions. Are these changes mainly for the good? And where is the money going? As you can imagine, it's easier to follow the money than to answer the more qualitative question. And finally, as you would expect from someone whose whole career has been spent in book publishing and who is the author of a book called Copy Fight, as Philip mentioned, I'm going to advocate for the values that copyright represents and remind everyone that this disruption isn't just about technology, it's about politics and culture. I'm going to take a sip of my water. Jay Rosen, who teaches journalism at New York University, posted something on his Press Think blog 10 years ago called The People Formerly Known as the Audience, which is obviously where the title of my talk comes from. I know that I'm talking to a room full of media academics, so I'm sure you'll be very well versed with this. But his manifesto, I think, is a useful way for me to frame what I'm talking about today. He wrote that these people, the ones formerly known as the audience, are no longer inactive, no longer on the end of a top-down media system that runs one way. They too have the tools of production, not just the old media oligarchs and hierarchies. Moreover, we see a horizontal flow, citizen to citizen, that's as real and consequential as the vertical one. These people, the audience, are simply the public made realer, less fictional, more able, less predictable. He wrote, "You should welcome that, media people, but whether you do or not, we want you to know that we're here." Well, at this point, 10 years later, yes, we recognise this new audience. Indeed, we are this new audience, and we're reeling from the consequences of these shifts and benefiting from them as well, in both directions of the vertical and the horizontal axes. There are millions of words from journalists, scholars and writers of all kinds about the tensions, financial and otherwise, of our new online world. These words are alarmist, utopian, accepting and dissenting. The New York Times critic A.O. Scott, in his recent book, Better Living Through Criticism, is especially astute as he notes the calamitous impact of digital technology on the old ways of distributing information. All of us have watched and indeed participated in century-old business models of advertising, subscription and retailing being unmade on the back of the collapse in the morale of journalists, writers and editors, not to mention our livelihoods. Scott notes that free online access means that readership increases, but still revenues fall, because the links between circulation and advertising no longer hold. He writes, "Writers and editors have begun to feel like blacksmiths and buggy whip dealers contemplating the rise of the automobile." But his discussion of the digital landscape is more nuanced and compelling than "the sky is falling, cries of many." He writes that the utopian, chaotic wildness of the internet, the web, even the word blogosphere sounds kind of quaint now, is becoming more ordered, lawful, like the frontier of a John Ford Western. But perhaps more relevant to the question of audience as I'm pursuing it today is Scott's observation that we exist in a nominally egalitarian world for audiences, at least for those who have the devices that allow easy internet access and the infrastructure that makes it possible. This means our culture lives almost entirely under the rubric of consumption. We are all consumers now. So where does this new reality leave Jay Rosen's utopian description of a citizen-to-citizen horizontal flow played out on social media as people share, curate, comment, retweet and like? Or the up-from-below vertical push that characterises the citizen journalism he's thinking of in a transformed mainstream media? Where indeed does it leave critics like A.O. Scott himself, the authoritative broadsheet voice directing people to this film or that one? And does it mean that the people formerly known as the audience can not only have a direct relationship with artists, writers, filmmakers, photographers, journalists, but because with the barriers to entry so low, they too are artists, writers, filmmakers, photographers and journalists themselves? We can apply these questions to any number of fields of cultural or artistic endeavour, but for the moment I'm going to stick with Jay Rosen's field of journalism. In the middle of June, as I was writing this talk, the American think tank, the Pew Research Centre, released its annual media survey, which happened to coincide with ABC TV's Media Watch devoting its whole program to failing business models in journalism. You'll know that Media Watch is only 15 minutes long, but really, as I think Paul Barry said that night, they could devote hours to the failing models of journalism. I think that the data and insights shared by both Pew and Media Watch, and they're only two of many, many sources, deserve serious attention. Pew found that half of American adults get news, not all their news, but they get news from Facebook. Daily newspaper circulation fell 7% from 2014 to 2015, and newspaper ad revenue fell 8% over the same period, the biggest drop since 2009. Everything is shifting to mobile phones. But if you're sitting there thinking that this is primarily a problem with old media and that the digital news websites have winning business models designed for the age we're in, rather than the one that launched a century ago, think again. It has been so easy to smugly criticise newspapers for being too slow to adjust to a world where the rivers of gold that were the newspaper classified advertisements no longer flow. I'm going to focus on one of the shiny new digital news sites, Vice Media, for a moment. A 2014 Guardian article mainly devoted itself to journalist and Vice CEO Shane Smith. Many of you will have heard of Shane Smith. Calling his comments bullish is an understatement. He said, if you look at what you can do online internationally and how you can reach people, I'm not going to be the next CNN, I'm not going to be the next ESPN, I'm not going to be the next MTV, he said. I'm going to be 10 times CNN, I'm going to be 10 times ESPN and 10 times MTV, because the number of video views are now in the billions. That's the disruption. That's the revolution. So, reading these comments now, in the aftermath of Vice Media announcing a restructure and job losses, mainly of their foreign correspondents, in late May, and this restructure happened to happen after a massive party in New York, where Smith made a big deal of being the #1 media company in the world. I think what I'm feeling is not quite Schadenfreude. In fact, it's not Schadenfreude at all, because over the past months, in addition to Vice, we've seen Salon, Gawker, Mashable and BuzzFeed all retrenching their staff and revising profits downwards. So if these sites can't reap the rewards of the age we're in, where is the digital ad money going? Why, with so many readers, are these new media sites struggling alongside the traditional newspapers, who also have millions of readers? Here's the kicker. Pew reports that 5 companies, Google, Facebook, Yahoo, Microsoft and Twitter, you may have heard of them, took home 65% of the $60 billion that was spent on digital advertising in 2015, and that was up 61% from 2014. Facebook alone accounted for 30%, or $8 billion of display ad revenue, also up 25% from 2014. As Pew put it, legacy news gets relatively little boost from the digital boom. So meanwhile, over on Media Watch, Paul Barry explained that digital sites get money from advertisers for the number of CPMs, that's clicks per thousand, on their websites. Alan Kohler pointed out that the price they get for these CPMs has collapsed, falling to 1/10 of what it was. And this is what he called it: one of the greatest price collapses in history. That is, the history of the world. And let's be honest, it was starting from a pretty low base. In Australia last year, according to Morgan Stanley, Google and Facebook's digital ad revenues grew by $1 billion. Everyone else, so all the traditional media companies, all the other website and digital media companies that aren't Facebook and Google, their revenue shrunk by $700 million. A leaders' debate between Malcolm Turnbull and Bill Shorten in June, that seems like a long time ago, doesn't it, was streamed live on Facebook. And why wouldn't it be? Everyone's getting their news there. It's like Marshall McLuhan's idea of the global village, except people are using the communication technology owned by Silicon Valley billionaires and the most powerful companies in the world. Platforms like Snapchat Discover, Google News, or Facebook Instant Articles, where now BuzzFeed, The Washington Post, The Guardian, The Huffington Post, and Fairfax Media are all publishing content, mean you don't ever have to leave those sites like Facebook to get news. And remember, Facebook is a platform where your ad blocking software probably won't work so well, and certainly not as well as it does on the websites of the newspapers themselves. And of course, there's no paywall in sight for users on Facebook. But while we don't have to pay, remember, nothing is free. What are we giving in return? What are we giving away? It's unregulated. So do we even know what stories they're choosing to run? If an algorithm is going to decide if a video story is more important than a less sexy but worthier piece of news that may genuinely be in the public interest? As Emily Bell wrote in a piece in the Columbia Journalism Review in March, we are handing the controls of important parts of our public and private lives to a very small number of people who are unelected and unaccountable. Now, you may or may not like the editorial line of The Australian or the Courier Mail, but at least you know what it is. If we even knew what Facebook CEO Mark Zuckerberg's political views were, do we know if he's trying to express them via Facebook? Or is it all about monetising other people's content and nothing more? And I have to say, as a kind of an aside, I found it interesting that Zuckerberg, in the midst of accusations of liberal bias, had a meeting with leading US conservative media figures in May, including the Fox News pundit Glenn Beck, as if he were an old school publisher, the way that, the Murdochs of the world have always done. And remember, Zuckerberg's only 31. But as we continue to follow the money, let's return to Australian business pundit Alan Kohler, who sold his own Business Insider online report to News Corp for top dollar. He seemed, frankly, in awe of the Facebook revenue model when he talked about it on Media Watch. He said Facebook are the champions of data because they have got everyone not only using Facebook, but revealing everything about themselves. We put our entire lives on Facebook, so Facebook knows everything about everybody. You can target your advertising through Facebook to the individual. I mean, nobody's been able to do that before. It's incredible. Indeed, writers like Jaron Lanier argue that Facebook users, the readers of so much free content, should in turn not give away their own personal information for free. Their demographic profiles, their interests, their buying habits, their baby photos, their views and their values. In effect, he argues that users shouldn't be passive consumers, but should convince the tech megaliths to buy what they themselves are selling themselves. And here's another thought. Maybe part of the problem is that audiences see themselves reflected better in the content of their social media peers. Here I'm talking not so much about their political or cultural views, but as a diverse group. In PwC's annual Media and Entertainment Outlook for Australia, recently published, Megan Brownlow was quoted as saying that lack of diversity was dragging Australian media down. The average employee in our media and entertainment sector, she wrote, is 27, male, Caucasian, and lives in Sydney's eastern suburbs or the inner west. Maybe the audience just does not want to see the world through this lens. But meanwhile, and I'm getting back to following the money, it's a bit of a quest. Forbes magazine reported that Google was certainly holding its own, with 2015 ad revenue up 17%. The Economist seemed relieved to find that Google's new parent company, Alphabet, was changing its existing practice and making its data more transparent, and that really was a significant move. So that The Economist could report that almost all of the $75 billion that Google made in revenue last year came from advertising, most of it search advertising, which is when Google places ads relevant to what someone is looking for online. And remember, Google has 70% of the global search market. The Economist points out that Google has profited handsomely from foreseeing two important trends: the rise of mobile phones and online video. It now has 7 products that claim 1 billion or more users each, including Search, Maps, Gmail, YouTube, the Google Play Store, the Android operating system, and the Chrome browser. And somehow I don't think they've included Google Books in that lineup. That's more than any other internet company. And as users spend more time with Google services, the company learns more about them and sells yet more ads to them. So, to put it bluntly, a user can Google an article published by Fairfax Media, who pays the salary of the editor who gave it the go-ahead, the salary of the journalist who researched and wrote it, the salary of the sub-editor, who actually is probably a contractor, the designer, the printer, the person employed to sell advertising space for Fairfax, the people marketing the Fairfax brand as one of authority and quality. Yet, the advertising return to Fairfax is minimal, while Google is doing okay, to put it mildly, as we've seen, for taking absolutely no risk and aggregating all the content. Between 1994 and 2014 in the United States, newsrooms lost more than 20,000 jobs, a 39% decline, Pew reported. The numbers here in Australia are comparable. In my book, Copy Fight, Sydney Morning Herald journalist Susan Wyndham comments, "Google ate my job," and she's right. It may be too early to tell if YouTube, owned by Google, will also eat the jobs of the people at Vice Media and similar video-heavy websites as well. But to return to the point of my talk, aren't readers the winners in all this? So much information for free from media sites, both local and global. We can read the great newspapers and journals of the world without having to wait for a print copy to arrive, as we used to. Usually we don't even have to pay for them. Moreover, readers can respond online to articles freely expressing their own views, as I'll discuss later. They can upload their own photos and videos, seeing them become part of a story online. They can contact writers directly through Twitter. The extent to which they click or share or retweet can inform the direction of the paper. Isn't this exactly the kind of direction we want modern, engaged audiences to take? I have one word in response to this: Kardashian. Though to use the Kardashians as a kind of straw family, blaming them for all the world's ills is unfair. It's not a zero-sum game. No one is making us click on stories about the Kardashians. We could just as easily click on a serious story about the war in Syria, the Panama Papers, or the acidification of oceans. And perhaps online newspapers assumed that was what we would do, that we would be drawn to them for fun, for trivial and diverting stories, but stay for something more serious. But we may glance at the headline, but we're less likely to click through and even less likely to scroll and read all of a 2,000-word article, let alone a 5,000 or a 10,000-word article. And the newspapers have software that can tell how far we have read into an article and what we're not reading at all. Organisations that are under commercial pressure and worried about shareholders in this environment are perhaps more likely to come up with this kind of headline. And so we get Kardashians. But perhaps we're getting less Kardashian than we think. People often complain about the lack of good investigative journalism in our newspapers, but I would remind you that the Newcastle Herald journalist, Joanne McCarthy, is another speaker at this conference, and you'll all know about her extraordinary work. In the past 2 months, we've had the massive collective journalistic global effort that is represented by the Panama Papers on our screens and in our newspapers. Fairfax, in collaboration with the Huffington Post, also ran a sustained 6-month investigation into Unaoil, a story of corruption and bribery involving corporations and government. But there is no denying that public interest journalism, which has probably only ever had a fairly limited broadsheet audience, is under tremendous pressure in an online world where it's easy to do WTCK stories, weather, traffic and crime, and I believe you know what the K stands for. It's glib and perhaps simplistic to put it like this, but what's popular won't always sit with what's in the public interest. People ask whether there can be journalism without traditional media companies, a world where we don't have so many traditional salaried journalists, but instead we have freelancers, vloggers, bloggers, citizen journalists, most of whom will be paid little, if anything. I think this is a sound question, but perhaps the more urgent question is this one. Can there be journalism without traditional readers? In other words, large groups of readers interested in serious issues who, as a newspaper or podcast or documentary or television news investigation, you can reach in a way that makes your investment in serious investigative journalism sustainable. I think that's much harder. And this is why I find the argument of Justin Schlossberg, a media lecturer at Birkbeck College at the University of London, and he's chair of the Media Reform Coalition as well, so persuasive. He suggests that a levy of 1% of revenue be paid by Google and Facebook to fund investigative journalism, given that the news feeds that lead people to them bring them enormous profits. It's another manifestation of the Google tax, which has become a generic term for getting these giant digital corporations to pay their fair share of tax in all the countries they operate in. Tax and copyright can be messy on their own though, let alone when mixed together. It is indeed complicated. So, for example, when Spain and Germany legislated that Google pay for linked content, the search engine shut down Spanish Google News altogether, and the Spanish press disappeared from the Google index. Spanish websites' traffic plunged by about 20%. In addition, the collection system was never properly implemented, so publishers never got a cent from anyone linking to their content anyway, in spite of all the losses. So this reminds us that we need Google as much as Google needs the content we make. Negotiation and conversation might be better than punitive legislation and decade-long legal battles, as in the Google Books case in the US. And talking about books is what I'm going to do next, but I need a gulp of water. Here's a nice picture to look at. So I'm going to talk about books, but by way of YouTube, which I know seems a bit crazy, but it will make sense. It's funny because you think, do YouTubers really need to write books to build their own brands? Look at someone like PewDiePie, who has 45 million followers. Why does PewDiePie need a book to boost his brand? But he did write a book, and the book is called This Book Loves You, something I'm compelled to mention as a way of preempting the distinct lack of love that many writers often feel from readers. And I'm going to be talking about that soon. And of course, back on YouTube, authors and publishers often make book trailers, which is something I could not have imagined doing 10 years ago. Or we'll have YouTube Q&A clips with authors made available for booksellers and for potential readers. You can see clips of authors performing at writers' festivals or listen to podcasts of their lectures and panel discussions. There is more scope than ever for readers to learn about their favourite writers' predilections, motivations and working habits. And authors can drive this in ways that someone like, say, Agatha Christie could never have dreamt of. In 2014, YouTube's global head of entertainment encouraged channel creators to build fan bases, not audiences. What's the difference, you ask? He wrote, an audience tunes in when they're told to, a fan base chooses when and what to watch. And entertainment boss Alex Carlos went on to explain, an audience changes the channel when their show is over. A fan base shares, it comments, it curates, it creates. And academic Henry Jenkins, all the way back in 2006, described modern fan cultures as a revitalisation of the old folk culture process in response to the content of mass culture. And that may well be the case, but it's happening in a corporate environment that's not folksy at all. As I've said, remember, YouTube is owned by Google. But one of the joys of books is that whether you call yourself a reader or a fan, you can read at a time of your choosing, on a device of your choosing, even a printed book, and in general you don't have to be wary of spoiler alerts on social media, as you might with, say, Game of Thrones, which of course started as a yet-to-be-finished series of books. You can become a critic, rating your book on Amazon or Goodreads. You can buy it from your local independent bookshop or one of our many local online retailers such as Booktopia, or you can buy it from the biggest retailer of anything, anywhere, Amazon, or the other outfit it owns, Book Depository, where you may also get brilliant recommendations driven by algorithms. You can listen to your book through Audible, owned by Amazon. You can read it through Apple's iBooks or Kindle or Kobo. Amazon is, of course, the largest retailer of books in the US. And although newspapers, as I've mentioned, might be able to see who is clicking on their stories, alarmingly, publishers have no idea who or where their customers are if their customers are buying through Amazon, which they mainly are. Amazon do not share this information. But interestingly, and luckily for me, the world of print books has been more resilient than anyone could have imagined in the digital age. This realisation may have started to dawn, not least may have just started to dawn, because we've lived through a period where there's been a great deal of attrition in the form of job losses, reduced earnings for authors, and more work for fewer publishing employees, as we make everything we publish available in all formats and promote it through traditional and social media platforms. I don't mean to come over all Pollyanna-ish, as I sound hopeful about my industry, perhaps seduced by the fact that at the Australian Book Industry Awards in May, we at New South were awarded Small Publisher of the Year. But really, there's evidence. On his blog late last year, Stephen Page, who's the head of Faber & Faber in the UK, wrote, "We feel that something is changing, something profound and cultural, as books and ideas have proved resilient to the disruptive technologies that have swept aside other industries. I can't prove this, but when I look at the range of good books being talked about and selling well this year, both at Faber and across the market, I feel confident of Faber's opportunity to thrive as the publisher we want to be, one supplying a hungry and intelligent readership with diverse and excellent books. I've got to say that the many people in the industry with a vocation for doing just this, be they agents, publishers, booksellers or librarians, should be feeling a spring in their step." Well, they're rousing words. And here I'm going to focus on the way in which authors and readers interact in our new social media realm, a more intimate book publishing version of Rosen's two-way vertical axis. As you would expect, there is great variation between authors' willingness to promote themselves on social media, just as in this audience there'll be people who share all their views on Twitter and those for whom the very thought of Twitter is a nightmare. But let me make a few observations, some of them personal and from my own professional life. When I recommend that we offer an author a contract, particularly an unknown author, my colleagues will check out their social media profile. And having 5,000 Twitter followers will help no end, believe me. Whether social media actually does sell books is another question, but it certainly helps to let both actual and potential readers know about bookstore appearances, opinion pieces you've written, or simply that your book exists. Young adult writers John Green or Patrick Ness have thousands of social media followers. And for my own son, when he dressed up as the yew tree from A Monster Calls for Book Week a few years ago, getting his photo retweeted by author Patrick Ness was a massive thrill. And indeed, anyone who's been to a literary festival in Australia over the past decade may have seen children's author Andy Griffiths confronted by a line of kids stretching for a kilometre or so, all waiting patiently to have their book signed by their hero. Again, that's not something Enid Blyton ever had to bother herself with. But it's wonderful for readers young and old. The kind of fandom expressed at writers' festivals can be inspiring and moving. I've published Anne Summers' books, The Misogyny Factor, and the latest edition of Damned Whores and God's Police. And to see women, young and old, come up to the signing table with their often tattered copies of Anne's books as they tell her that she's changed their lives is very powerful. Yet many writers who are used to live web chats and Ask Me Anythings and podcasts and public appearances emphasise that their main responsibility is to the work. Australian writer Charlotte Wood says the real work is the writing. Marketing and branding and all that junk is simply no substitute for doing the work. Now, you may have heard that many writers in Australia have been arguing lately that getting paid for all this work could be about to get much harder. As I move into the final part of this talk, I'm going to combine the theme of audience with that of copyright. Many artists find their incomes dwindling because so much is available online for free. In the case of books, the Productivity Commission's 2016 recommendations that parallel importation restrictions be removed and that the Copyright Act introduce a fair use regime strike fear into the hearts of many filmmakers, TV producers, authors and publishers. I'm sympathetic to most progressive and reforming tendencies, but not these proposals because they're regressive. Like most publishers, writers, journalists, artists and content producers of all stripes, I think they would gut creative industries and lead to less certainty and income for individual creators than we have now. More than 15,000 people have signed a petition on change.org opposing the Productivity Commission's reforms. The Commission's website crashed on the day that submissions were due, and hearings took place throughout June, with speakers for and against the changes. And of course, all this has played out alongside cuts to the Australia Council, which itself has prompted far more coverage of the arts than we would usually expect. Now, you may be familiar with the articles written recently by people like Tim Winton, Richard Flanagan, Nikki Gemmell, and many others talking about the values that these changes would erode. Also, we've seen musicians like Debbie Harry and Nelly Furtado writing passionately about the impact illegal downloading has had on the music industry. And Taylor Swift has become the poster girl for copyright, taking the fight against streaming that brings no benefits to performers to Spotify and Apple Music. More recently, T Swizzle has challenged YouTube on unlicensed music and the inefficacy of takedown notices. Like most performers, and for that matter users, I've no doubt that she would prefer payment from YouTube for her music and the hundreds of other musicians that joined her, instead of it not being available at all. These are all popular, successful artists, you might even say beloved. Not that you would know it if you read the comments below the articles they've all posted on The Guardian. I've done this for the greater good. And even skimming these comments quickly, and I'm not going to read them all out loud, but I'm just going to flick through, so read the comments behind me. But even if you skim them, you quickly lose any sense that there's a nurturing community of engagement between writers and readers in an artistic marketplace. There's very little evidence at all that what writers produce might have any value, let alone cultural worth that you might think about paying for. It's a product like any other. And in this one, I was really struck by the disconnect between what people think writers earn and what they actually earn. I have to take deep breaths, actually, as I look at some of this. It's quite depressing. And, you know, just one further point about the money that artists earn. In the book Copy Fight, one of the contributors, Justin Hazelwood, who's a musician and a comedian better known as the bedroom philosopher, he makes the point that people think you're incredibly wealthy because your song has been played on Triple J a few times, and it's just not like that. So this dude was saying, and I've you know, improved some of the spelling and grammar. He just thinks it should all be shut down. Crass self-serving protectionism. It goes on and on. That may mean you guys too. And the visual artists, they really cop it. So we all need to be more relevant, apparently. So this is a very random sample taken from The Guardian's Australian edition. So all written by your fellow citizens and all anonymous, of course. Perhaps what I really learnt was that I should not violate my policy to never look at the comments. But I started looking at the responses that Nikki Gemmell received from an article that she wrote, a very passionate article about copyright in The Australian, and I thought, even though I take this keynote very seriously, I'm not going there because the sexism and misogyny that she was objected to was just, for me, unreadable and very depressing. Of course, a certain kind of person engages in the anonymous negativity that these forums allow. But, you know, I had thought naively that people liked Booker Prize winner Richard Flanagan and his writing colleagues. But I'm going to finish on a fierier note. Many of the writers who contributed to Copy Fight called copyright a kind of codified respect. We can see from the hostile comments here that people can make whatever comment they want in public about writers and artists as long as it's not libelous. But copyright is supposed to protect the work, allowing it to enter into a reciprocal arrangement with artists and their audiences. It exists to allow artists to be paid, or at least to be able to choose not to be paid if they want to make their work available for free. Copy Fight argued that the glue that binds our ecosystem of creativity, content and commerce together is copyright. It's more relevant than ever in the digital world. The tech giants, the main distributors of information in our age, are largely indifferent to the rights of producers. They're only interested in consumers. Google is the main lobbyist for a fair use regime in Australia. When we look at the shifting power relationships between all the players in our culture, there may be more power lying with audiences than ever before. There's certainly no scarcity of content, and it's readily available, legally or not. Prices are lower, if not free, and choices are greater for audiences than everyone in this room could have imagined. But the real power lies with the tech giants, who see audiences as nothing but consumers. Yes, there is power in art, in story, in song, in reportage, but that power is diminished without the protections of copyright. Thank you.
Thank you for that.